The Chinese head tax was a fixed fee charged to each Chinese person who entered Canada. The Chinese who came to Canada had to help build the railroad. Then after, they would not let them stay in Canada. The Chinese who came to Canada had to pay $50 to come to Canada. Then later they raised it to $100 and then to $500. A lot of the Chinese immigrants began to come when the 1885 gold rush started. More than 15,000 Chinese laborers arrived from 1881 to 1885. The head tax was in effect for 38 years, 1885, 1923, and about 85,000 Chinese had to pay over $20 million in tax. The first Chinese to stay in Canada came from San Francisco, and they were also following the gold rush in the 1960s. Many of the Chinese moved on to prospect for gold in the Caribou Mountains of British Columbia. The Canadian government quickly enacted the Chinese Immigration Act, which included a $50 head tax. This amount was deliberately set to be a financial hardship based on the findings of the Royal Commission. The average Chinese laborer earned $300 a year and saved a modest $43 after living expenses. By 1902, it was clear that the head tax had not diminished Chinese immigration. Even after it doubled from 50 to 100, a second inquiry, Royal Commission on Chinese and Japanese Immigration, recommended that the head tax to be increased to $500. This last fee, instituted by Parliament in 1903, was the equivalent of 2 years' salary or the purchase of 2 homes. The Chinese head tax relates to the Charter because it shows how at the time the Canadians won't let people with a different language and a different religion into the country without making them pay $50, then a couple years $100, and then $500. And $500 back then could buy them 2 houses. And that shows that they didn't have equality back then. But they also didn't have the Charter when this was happening. And each Chinese person paid about $3,500 a year just to get into Canada. And the Chinese who came to Canada didn't have freedoms either. They don't have mobility rights either because they don't have the right to come into the country without paying a lot of money. And they didn't have democratic rights because they couldn't vote or anything, and they couldn't say what they thought. And also for mobility rights, they didn't have the right to come into Canada, and they couldn't remain in Canada. And they also couldn't work or move anywhere, and they didn't have language rights either because they didn't speak English or French. And they didn't have equality rights either because they didn't have the right to be fair, couldn't give their opinions in newspaper and other media. They didn't have fundamental freedoms either because they couldn't peacefully meet with others, and they didn't have the responsibility to vote in the election.